Maserati is proud to partner with Monocle on Culture on Monocle Radio. Folgore is the Italian word for lightning. Put another way, power in its purest form. The new all-electric Maserati Gran Turismo and Gran Cabrio Folgore truly deliver the grand in grand touring. With up to 450 kilometres on one full battery charge and flashing from 0 to 100 kilometres an hour in just 2.7 seconds, Folgore delivers. Higher speed, blazing acceleration and sensational agility. A true Maserati sports car on its own terms. And Folgore can count on the largest network of power points in the world. And thanks to ultra-fast charging, getting back up to 100 kilometre range takes just a few minutes. You see, the world is changing, roads are changing. From inside a Maserati Folgore, everything that once seemed the future is right at hand. Gran Turismo Folgore and Gran Cabrio Folgore. Pure luxury, pure performance, pure Maserati.
Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bounds. On today's show, I'm speaking to the author and music critic Will Hodgkinson about his new book titled Street Level Superstar, A Year with Lawrence. Who? You know, Lawrence, the pop star who only requires the one name, like Madonna or Morrissey. Such is his stardom. You know, the pop star, or is he? If you're still scratching your head, then put it this way. Lawrence, having emerged from Birmingham's suburbia, founded the band Felt in the early 1980s, releasing 10 albums and 10 singles as per his own manifesto. Felt made some beautiful, lyrical guitar-based music, but didn't much trouble the charts. Then Lawrence founded Denim with the ambition to be an out-and-out pop phenomenon, but it all went wrong and ended in depression, addiction, and a stint of homelessness. Lastly, we have Mozart Estate. Surely this band would show the Spotify massive the wonders of Lawrence's worldview and pop sensibilities. Well, not so far. Lawrence, however, has been an object of fascination for connoisseurs of the what might have been, as well as for those who really and rightly love some of the music that he's made. Lawrence's career is akin to that of a great lost artist, but he's very much alive and has spent 4 decades telling the world that he's great and wants to be famous. And Will's book is partly an attempt to find out why he's not. It's part travelogue, part pop history, part as told to memoir, and also a very generous, hilarious, charming and tender portrait of an unstintingly rigorous artist for whom the vision seems worth more than life itself, and the pursuit of that vision is more vital than success. Maybe for Lawrence, living life in the way he chooses is the art form at which he has been a most brilliant success. So joining me to discuss Street Level Superstar is its author, Will Hodgkinson. And to give a little context, I asked Will to read an excerpt, and at this point in proceedings, Felt are on Alan McGee's Creation Records, home to Bobby Gillespie's Primal Scream, and later on Oasis. But Lawrence feels slighted by the label's focus on acid house. Why are they raving and not clearing up after themselves, wonders the ever fastidious Lawrence.
Culturally, it wasn't a great time for Lawrence because Alan McGee, Jeff Barrett and the rest of the Creation gang had discovered acid house to such an extent that they couldn't pour a cup of tea without making shapes in the air as if in the throes of ecstasy. The attitude seemed to be, you're either on the buzz or off the buzz, said Lawrence. You weren't part of the gang if you weren't into it, which didn't work for me because it didn't resonate. I didn't want to go on the mystery tour. And by the time I got to Brighton, it seemed like the entire independent world were finally waking up to something that had been happening in the clubs for years. Everyone was going around saying, "Are you into it yet? Are you into it yet?" And I wasn't into it. I'm not a disco person anyway. I've been to clubs in the past where Bobby Gillespie and the rest of Primal Scream would get up and dance the moment Street Fighting Man by the Rolling Stones came on. And I'd go, wow, they're all jumping about. In his book Creation Stories, Alan McGee claimed Lawrence's legendary fastidiousness was all an act, because when he was meant to be looking after the flat, the kitchen was a total mess. "That's because the only place I wouldn't touch was the kitchen," protested Lawrence. who was inspired to walk extra fast down Welling High Street the moment his commitment to cleanliness was called into question. Alan would eat Heinz macaroni cheese in a tin. I couldn't go near it because as far as I was concerned, the tin was infected. The kitchen was not my domain. There was no way I was going to touch Alan McGee's used cutlery.
And that was Will Hodgkinson reading from Street Level Superstar. And now, back to the interview. Will joins us now, familiar voice to listeners of Monocle on Culture. Will, congratulations on this wonderful, wonderful book. Charming, strange, and basically very hopeful at the end.
That's
as
a nice
well.
way of putting it. Thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
And I wanted to know, first of all, about how you planned your time with Lawrence. As you allude to in the book, it's often a difficult thing to do, to put dates in the diary and have him turn up on time. But yeah, how did you plan the kind of shape of the book before you planned the feel of it, I suppose?
So what happened was, the very beginning, there were talks about doing a book on Lawrence. My publisher was interested, and I knew that Lawrence didn't want to do a memoir himself, and I certainly didn't want to ghost a book because I've known Lawrence for 20 years and I know his eccentricities, and it would just be impossible. So it was his idea initially to look at books like, there's a Truman Capote book called The Duke and His Domain, which is about Marlon Brando. It's really a long essay, but it's a brilliant piece of writing where he observes Marlon Brando, and he does speak to him, but it's really about the impression. And at the point, this was when, just before Lawrence had a new album coming out, and he said, well, we've got all this activity. The album's coming out in January. This was last year, I suppose, or 2023, I think. The album's coming out. We've got all these concerts. And I'm trying to rebuild my life because he'd had a lifetime of, I guess, crushed dreams or missed opportunities felt with the 80s indie band who were kind of cool, but never really broke through. Yeah. Denim were going to be the big band. They're on EMI and it all fell apart. And then he had terrible addiction problems. He was homeless. He had mental health issues. And he kind of got through it to an extent where he was functioning. And he thought, right, now I'm going to do this all over again. The idea with the structure of the book was to follow him over the year. Obviously, I can't do every day because I'm busy and he's busy. But we went pretty much every Friday of the week. We would go, what he does is he goes on these long walks in suburbs for inspiration. He doesn't have a phone in the normal sense. He's got an old Nokia phone. He doesn't have maps. He's never been on the internet. He's got no connection with computers or the digital world. So he gets a train ticket and he goes somewhere and he wanders around. And what I quickly realised is because he looks so strange, the way the world reacts to him is different to how it would react to you or I. So I'll give you an example. We went to Benetton on Oxford Street one day. I wanted to do a day in Soho. Yeah.
This is a bravura little part of the book. It's a wonderful example of the eccentricities of Lawrence and how he's observed by the wider world.
How he's observed by the wider world. Yeah. So, when I walk into Benetton or any of those shops, what would happen is that you might have an over-attentive sales assistant and you don't really want to buy something, but they kind of, say, well, that looks good on you, or that kind of thing. Yeah. With Lawrence, the sales assistant looked horrified, and then 2 seconds later, this burly security guard was inches away from us. Because he thought that Lawrence was a shoplifter. Yeah. Things like this happen. So then I thought, okay, so the album came out in January. It didn't do very well. It's a brilliant album. And he was really dismayed. I don't understand it. And I realised that he was operating on this old system. He said, I don't understand it. It got, you used to get a review in the NME. And then the record shops had it and it was great and everything was fine. But he was kind of talking about what happened in the 1980s. Yeah, yeah. He was stuck in this strange pattern and he's phenomenally frustrated. So I followed him over this year, and at the same time, there was this kind of mythologizing or even sort of kind of heroizing of Lawrence building up, because a sculptor called Corin Johnson, who's a really successful sculptor, he's got sculptures in Westminster Abbey. He wanted to do a bust of Lawrence, and actually it was pretty much finished when the year began, and then we were trying to find a home for it. So we had this pattern for the book, but I didn't know what was going to happen, obviously. I didn't know how it's going to pan out. And the massive head, this bust of Lawrence, is a recurring and amusing motif. What will happen to this kind of Ozymandias type thing? Millstone in a way.
Millstone, exactly, yeah. I'd love to come on to the idea of what sort of pop star is Lawrence and what sort of era was he primed for. But this idea of the perambulatory memoir, I suppose, is really runs through your book, Will, and it's wonderful. I was reminded, do you know the films of Patrick Keeler, Robinson in Space, and these kind of mad things? It's a sort of about a London flaneur, a fictional London flaneur called Robinson, walking around like Baudelaire and Rabelais in Paris, and it's an amazing thing. Or John Clare, the Ian Sinclair's book, Road to the Horizon, about John Clare. These kind of when you get into a fugue state of walking, and this feels like what Lawrence does, rather than over the fields of East Anglia or through the kind of great parks of London. He's doing it in grotty southeast London suburbs like Welling, which isn't too far away.
Welling, Waltham Cross.
Which is in the north. Very weird places. There is something of the kind of, there's something you want to ask him about psychogeography at some point, I suppose. Whereas for him, it's the sort of rough and ready place, the like of which he grew up in, because his father was a market stall trader and he helped his dad out on the market stall in Birmingham. So is this, do you think, where he gets this kind of this sort of appetite for the rough and ready side of life?
I think so. What happened was also he was, and what Lawrence does, I realised, first of all, he and this happened when he read the book, I guess we'll come on to that later, but he focuses on details, not big things, and he obsesses over details. And he always said to me that he really fell out with his parents because they lived on a council estate in Birmingham, in Edgbaston, and he loved it. This is when he was a little kid. And he thought it was fantastic. And then his mother made the move to Wateralton, which is a little suburb. It's actually very nice. We ended up going there. But he hated it. And it was he felt it was boring and he was stuck there. And he saw that as the defining crisis of his life. And he's always coming back to that. So on one level, he's obsessed with the city centre and all the kind of nastiness of the city centre, the homelessness and all the troubled aspects of it. And on the other, he is on a mission to kind of replicate the boring suburb he grew up in and understand why he is the way he is. Because there's never been any therapy with Lawrence. There's never been any analysis in the normal way. And I think that was part of the reason the way he sees life.
Yeah, is there any therapy in his music, I wonder, in the kind of lyrical content of his music? Because Felt, the first band he was in, he said who were kind of cool but not successful. They were on Creation Records, Alan McGee's Creation Records, later home to Super Furry Animals and Oasis and things like this, Boo Radley's. But was that slightly more sort of lyrical, introspective, guitar-based, indie pop, sort of shoegazy stuff? Was that therapy to him in any sense? Or did he not need it at that time because he was perhaps going to be a bona fide 80s pop star?
I think he was going to be a bona fide 80s pop star. Someone pointed this out, actually, and I didn't realise it myself. They said that if you listen to Felt, it's a bit like a child's dreamlike vision of what the adult world might be. Because he was very young when he started Felt. He was about 17 or 18 when he did the initial single just on his own under the name of Felt. Then he formed the band with people from Wateralton. And it's dreamlike. There's a beautiful song called Primitive Painters, which a lot of people might know, with Elizabeth Fraser from the Cocteau Twins. And on that song, he's talking about wanting to be more than humanity can ever be. He says things like, there's a line about dragons fly in the air, and humans are just inert and stuck. You can't escape the human reality. So I think that was very much the childlike fantasia, And then when you would get to his second band, which was Denim, he was an adult and it hadn't worked out with Felt. Well, they were quite successful. They were quite hip. They were hip.
Yeah.
After finishing it over 10 years, which is always his plan, I think with Denim, he was looking back to his childhood and making sense of it. So there's a song called The Osmonds, which mentions all these little Osmonds running around everywhere in the 1970s. But then it starts talking about the IRA bombings in Birmingham, which affected everyone. He said everybody knew someone who died. So it becomes incredibly poignant. So I think Lawrence has always had a Peter Pan thing. And if he had grown up, he's a working class guy. Like you say, his father was a market trader. You didn't have analysis, especially in late 60s and early 70s Birmingham. It wasn't part of the culture. So I think a lot of this stuff, as a sensitive person, he's kind of working it out, but not in a way that would necessarily be codified. Yeah. Or would have a name, So I think he's naturally working it out, but I don't think it's it's not a conscious attempt at analysis.
I was sort of struck rereading the book, actually, that he kind of felt like I mean, he had his in Morris D Bank. He perhaps had his Johnny Marr, but he feels a little bit like what might have happened to Morrissey if he wasn't successful with the Smiths.
Someone said that, and I think that's a really interesting thing to say.
The sensitive, hugely creative, hugely exacting, kind of almost maddeningly exacting,
and very
individual.
egotistical as well.
Yeah, sort of solipsistic type of person. And so what type of? I wonder what sort of successful pop star Lawrence would have been, or may still be, if he's a successful pop star, because he does feel like, as we said, he's in that kind of Morrissey-ish mould, perhaps in certain respects, not probably in others. But you said he's sort of backdated to the 1980s. He's expecting, reviewing the Melody Maker to kind of launch the career of his next venture and things like that. And he is a sort of backdated pop star. I mean, having spent a year with him, how do you, and I think this is a thought that occurred to Paul Kelly, who made the Lawrence of Belgravia film a decade ago or so, 8 years ago, that he's so exacting that he's kind of, he's pointed himself absolutely away from success and fame, that it might not come snapping at his heels anymore. But yeah, what sort of success do you think he would have had? I
think success was always going to be kept as a fantasy, because he's always talking about fantasy things. His latest one, he talked about it a lot when we were on our walks. He said, when I win the £77 million Euro lottery rollover or something like this, I don't know what it was, but I don't even know if he's bought a lottery ticket. I mean, it's in his mind. He was going to win this ticket, and then he was going to buy a house in North London, a house in North East South West. He's going to buy a house at each one, and all these dreams.
He does have this strange sort of magic with a K kind of thing about him, doesn't he? He's a bit of a wizard figure.
He's a little bit of a wizard figure. It's a lot of fantasy.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I would say is that he was a kid. So he's now 62 or 3 years old. So that means that when he was little, when he was just the right age, he saw Mark Bolan on Top of the Pops. I think it was Get It On he saw, and it blew his mind. It just absolutely, this is what I want to be. He's a beautiful pop star. It's an amazing song. It's catchy. It's just got everything, the world in which he wanted. And of course, he was growing up in a very messy house he didn't like, with warring parents, fighting all the time, a bad relationship with his mother, the whole thing. So it was all about this fantasy. And then he discovered with Felt that you could have an alternative pop career. And there's a great bit where he's saying he's trying to tell his mother, because they were laughing, and go, what are you doing? Why are you dressed like Rigsby from Rising Damp, which is the kind of indie style at the time? And he was trying to tell them, he said, no, that you see, there's a different thing where you don't have to be a big extrovert. You can be an indie star, or he didn't call it indie, he hates that term, alternative. And you can go on the John Peel show, and you get written about in The Enemy, and you become famous. And he was thinking about bands like The Fall. And his mum and dad and sister were going, what are you on about? You're never one of the kids who stood up on the table and started singing. And he can't really sing either. Yeah. He's essentially a songwriter.
A reedy voice.
Yeah. I don't want to put him down, but Michaela, who's his ex-girlfriend, who really said some terrible things about him, she said an amazing line. I mean, she said, I never thought he was going to be successful. He couldn't sing the note. He couldn't even talk the note. Which is quite an amazing put down. Fairly damning.
Yeah.
But of course he has a style, as Lou Reed has a style, and as John Lydon has a style, and that's really what you need. So he, in the initial times, I think he realised, okay, I'm not the kind of character, he's not a big character who's going to be like the next David Bowie, but I could be the next Lou Reed. He felt that could happen. I think it's really, really hard to say, because I think he always wanted success, and he'll say to this day that, he just wants to be rich and famous. But then if you look at his history, there has been self-sabotage along the way. So I can't help but think there's an element to Lawrence that actually he knows that he couldn't wander around Welling if he was famous. He knows that he can't soak in this amazing stuff that no one else sees. Other people would just pass a kebab shop called Chick Chicken and just ignore it, and he goes, Chick Chicken, what an amazing name. So you have things like that. He gets excited by the everyday, the strangeness of the everyday, almost as if he's seeing supermarkets, Costa coffee shops, the bland things that most of us go, oh, it's just awful, isn't it? It's so homogenous. And in that Costa coffee shop, he sees someone in a mobility scooter or something, which just fascinates him, and that will be the beginning of a song.
Yeah, and there are many beautiful and hilarious moments, and you're very generous to Lawrence and very patient with him, and he is very charming, as much as he's frustrating in the telling, around how much precise milk goes into one of his very milky Costa cups of tea. And as you say, the lyrical content of these slightly shabby, kind of very ordinary kind of places that absolutely, that send him into kind of heights of creativity, supposedly. I mean, they felt supported pulp, right? I mean, this is became the stock in trade of what pulp kind of were doing in the late 80s and 90s as well.
That's interesting. Well, it was Denim who supported pulp, but pulp were fans of felt. So that was an interesting one. And I spoke to Jarvis Cocker briefly for the book. I didn't speak to many people at all because I wanted it to be an observation.
I'm not talking about copying it at all.
No, but
I just mean there's an interesting through line. Yeah,
a comparison. There's definitely a comparison, but the difference is that Jarvis is very, very professional. Jarvis knows how to perform. He knows how to get up there, give everybody what they want. He knows how to, be charming, and he's a really very nice person. Not that Lawrence isn't, but Lawrence is much more awkward and much more difficult and fine. So, there's cancelled gigs. There's plenty of times when he didn't turn up to me, when we were meant to be meeting and stuff. So that kind of thing you wouldn't get from someone who's just is working out how to succeed. So this is the thing. I think there's a side to Lawrence. As much as he says he wants it, he does understand something about himself, and he knows that really he's a street-level superstar. That's what he is. He walks down the street, and in his mind, he's a star. But at the same time, he needs to be in the street. As much as he says he wants to be cut off, he never wants to go on the tube again. He'd love to drive around in a limousine and private jets and all the rest of it. I don't know if he really does. I think he wants to keep it as a fantasy.
He's got a fear of success in a way.
I think he's got a fear of success, and we'll see. I mean, I'm not saying the book is going to make him famous, but it's getting some attention. And actually, when you see him so for example, we did the first talk at End of the Road Festival, and we had some advanced copies. And so when he was signing the books, he was amazing with the people. They're coming up to him and saying, "Oh, I saw you at Friars Club in Aylesbury with Felt in 1983." And he's going, "Oh, yeah, I remember that. Yeah, very good gig, very good gig." Of course he did. I mean, he couldn't have done, but he knew exactly how to be charming.
How to do it.
How to play the role. So it's a real conundrum. And that was really... It wasn't writing a book about a famous pop star. It wasn't writing a book about someone who tried to be in a band in their youth and, had a normal life, as most people do. It's about someone who had this dream and never gave up, but the cost of never giving up that dream was massive. I mean, there's no family, no children, not that he ever wanted them, no relationship beyond for the last 25 years, really no money, but there is always this commitment to his vision, which is not wavered.
And just to go back to before the beginning of the book, I guess, what was your pitch to 9/8 Books? They've got a great list, especially at the moment with your book front and centre, but they've got a really, really interesting publisher to check out.
Yeah, Simon Raymond's book, I recommend that. Superb.
Yeah, so there's lots of good stuff on there. What were your conversations with them? Because, Lawrence is such an acquired taste. He's the greatest. He's been reviewed or your book has been reviewed with Lawrence as being the greatest pop star who never had a hit single kind of thing. So was something like that the pitch, I wonder?
What happened is that I'd done a book a few years previously called In Perfect Harmony, which is a celebration of sing-along pop. All the 70s pop that wasn't fashionable, like Chicory Tip or Lieutenant Pigeon. And there's a connection there because Lawrence loved all that stuff. And actually, he turned me on to a lot of it. That book was very different in the sense that I wanted to take it very seriously. The music was very silly, but I thought, okay, I'm going to do a serious social history. I'm going to interview everyone. And it came out on 9/8. It did all right, nothing amazing, but it sort of sowed the seed for this book because of the connection with Lawrence. And Pete Selby, who's a brilliant publisher and very much one of those really rare publishers now who is going down his own individual interests. Obviously he's got to think about what might work. But this was definitely a hard sell. So Pete wanted to do it. Pete wanted initially, he asked about the possibility of the memoir. He said, could you ask Lawrence? And I said, Lawrence doesn't want to do it. He dug out the original email the other day. But then we had this meeting with Lawrence in Maison Berthaud in Soho. And he sat there with his milky tea and said what he didn't want to do. It's mainly about what he did. And Lawrence is all about rules. And he kept saying, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do that. I don't want a boring story. I don't want my drug hell. I don't want like, oh, we were so poor, you know, all this kind of stuff. And now we're so rich, whatever. He did, which couldn't have been in his case. But he didn't want to do the rock biog.
Yeah.
And he was the one who said we should go on these walks. I put together a proposal, spoke, you know, a bit with whatever. I think I just did the usual, you know, sample chapter and everything. And Pete then really had to sell it because he had a meeting and people didn't know who he was, didn't know who Lawrence was. And eventually I got a deal for, you know, quite a modest advance. And the initial plan was that it was going to come out in January. It was going to come out in January because it was seen as something which would be not get much attention. And in January, you've got a better chance of getting reviewed. It won't sell many copies, but if it's good, word of mouth will help build over the year. And then when Pete read it, he loved it so much that he said, we're going to do it in September. And I said, you're mad. September is the biggest month of the publishing
You're fighting off, you know, Robert Harris and
Yeah.
you know, huge political biographies.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah, it's great. It's great.
Yeah, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And he held his nerve much more than I did. And he said, no, I think we should do it. I really, really like this book. It wasn't a hard sell for Pete because Pete wanted to do it from the start. And this is what I mean about how brilliant it is to have a real
champion,
a kind of a visionary publisher, you know. And he's quite populist. He likes pop music. And Lawrence loves pop music. Lawrence loves Charlie XCX and Lana Del Rey. You know, he's not an indie guy, actually. So, yeah, so that's how it happened. I mean, it was definitely a hard sell. And I really didn't think that... I was pleased with it because I thought it's a very unusual book. It's kind of got a strange structure. It's got a strange ending. It's based around these wanderings, like you say. I didn't think of the term psychogeography, but that's since been mentioned. It's an odd book. And of course, at the heart of it is someone most people haven't heard of. So I thought it's really, really hard sell. But yeah, I mean, listen, I never, ever, ever count my chickens. But at the moment, people do seem to be reacting to it, which is great. And I think a lot of it is down to the fact that it's not about failure, maybe. Maybe it's not about success, but maybe it's about sacrifice.
Yeah, and it's also about success on its own terms. If you look in the mirror and you think you're a rock star, you think you're a pop star, then that's kind of, if you've got an adoring audience of one and that person is yourself and it helps you get out of bed in the morning, sometimes not on time.
That's a brilliant way
But
of
then
putting it.
that certain way of perhaps the therapy, of the self-therapy that Lawrence is exacting upon himself, and presumably the help that your book and your company and your focus on his life and his works kind of offered him, I guess, right? That was a nice, it's a red thread, kind of a subtle red thread through the book.
So when we were doing it, that's the other thing I should say, Robert. When we started, two things happened. One is he gave me a load of rules. Some of them were utterly ridiculous. One of them was no anecdotes. So, what are you talking about?
Because actually the book is absolutely pumped full of amazing anecdotes.
Yeah.
There's a lot of whole pages just of wonderful dialogue between the two of you, or his musings and ramblings, which are absolutely brilliant, spot on.
I mean, the rules were crazy. Some of them I agreed to.
Yeah.
He said he didn't want me to speak to all of the members of Felt, of which there are loads, because he falls out with people. And I said, you know what, okay, let's base it in the present. And if people come into it, fine. He didn't want me to use the word just. And I said, why not? You went, I just don't like it. I was like, okay, well, I'm going to ignore that. So a lot of it was control.
I simply can't bear it.
Yeah. A lot of it was control. A lot of it was nerves on his part. But once we got going on the walks, I'd ask him anything and he was open. So anything about painful things about his childhood, painful things about, girlfriends and the terrible relationships he'd had. And and I did speak to old girlfriends and they said some things that any normal rock star would never in a million years want in their book. Really not complimentary about his kind of erotic prowess, I suppose. And he was absolutely fine. He said, yeah, it's true. But when he read it initially, he was really upset. And this is the thing, because you're dealing with someone's life. Now, I'm trying to be really, really honest. I didn't want to do a hagiography, but at the same time, I am affectionate towards him, and I'm trying to understand him. And I do have a lot of time and love for him. He read the first chapter and he was really, really upset, and he came around to my house. He was demanding loads of changes, and we had a huge row. And I said, listen, I wouldn't change your song, so why are you trying to change my book? And it's like, well, it is about me. I was like, well, yeah, but still, you let me do this. Anyway, in the end, I said, go away and read it rather than start trying to change it as you go along. And then he came back and he never really said it to me, but he was going around telling other people. He said, yeah, it's brilliant. It's a masterpiece. And it's all about me. So that was fine. He had lots of changes, which I fought over. And then the changes that I allowed would be factual. So he's very, 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 very detailed. He'd get so upset about a photograph of the Sex Pistols from 1976, which was at the Gibbous Club in Paris, but it was at some other club in Paris, and we'd have hour-long arguments about that.
It's amazing. And he was also at certain times thought you would simply ghostwriting his biography, or not quite that. But there were times when he kind of got the wrong end of the stick, or was kind of artfully getting the wrong end of the stick. It seems. Yeah,
that's when he met Bobby Gillespie for lunch, and Bobby Gillespie had a hit with his own memoir, which was his memoir, and he wrote every word of it. It was very different, and it's called Tenement Kid. And Bobby was saying, listen, it's really great doing a book. It really builds your confidence. And then he after all these battles, he came up to me and said, yeah, I now see that doing this book will be very good for me. And doing my book will be very good for you. I was like, you're not doing it. You haven't written a word of it. And then he said, no, but I'm going to be sending you so many corrections and changes. And you've got to show it to me. I didn't show it to him until I'd finished. And so, because I knew if I did, I'd be derailed. I knew that he'd get into my head and start demanding changes, and I'd be upset. And also, I should point out, it's not like he was difficult and I was wonderful. Being a musician comes with difficult characters, but so does being a writer. And I've got an ego and a pride in my work that I didn't want to be messed around with.
There's another way into, as if there weren't a million ways into this great book, Will. Another way in that I was thinking of when I was reading it is that it is almost like you're looking at if David Bowie wasn't a massive legend. You know what I mean? It's kind of, there's something like that. If Michael Jackson wasn't a huge star, etc., 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 what would have happened if Madonna hadn't had a hit? What would these people be like? Because there is something of the life force of the star about him, his exacting standards. He's also a massive scholar of pop. That's in the Morrissey sense of writing letters to the enemy and pretending to be interviewed by rock journalists and stuff. There's all that about him as well, right?
Actually, it's really interesting you pointed that out, because we were going around Beckenham, which is where David Bowie lived with Angie. Yeah. And, we would get like some of the kids at the bus stop were being rude and all this kind of stuff. And he was saying, he's talking about Bowie. This is when Bowie would wear a dress, and he'd just become a father in 1970. And he said, but I get the impression that the people of Beckenham respected Bowie. And, he didn't have to go into the supermarket. That's what Angie was for. And he said, but I haven't got an Angie. I've got nobody. I have to do it myself. I have to go to the supermarket myself. So he's comparing himself to Bowie and thinking,
because no one went to the supermarket for him that he isn't a massive rock star.
That's his mind. In his mind. Yeah, in his mind. He always... And, this is the thing. He'd often talk about he wanted a buddy, he wanted a friend, he wanted a girlfriend who was like a friend, a partner in this life. And I'd say, well, you do have friends. And he said, no, I haven't got any real friends. And then I'd say, well, what do you want? He'd say, well, I just want someone to, check up on me. I want someone to do my shopping. I want someone to, if I've got to go somewhere to some award ceremony, I want someone to accompany me and keep the fans away. I was like, that's not a friend, that's a servant.
He is a kind of genius. He's just kind of autodidact. He is. I think he's. Do you think he's better off not being a star? He's obviously kind of a friend of yours.
He's allowed. So not being a star has allowed him to develop these eccentricities. If he had become famous at 19 or 20, he'd probably be just like so many other stars who just demand things and just expect other people to do things for them and don't think about them. But because he was forced into penury, no money whatsoever. There was a point when he said to me, okay, you're going to find... We did a sort of day in the life, typical day in the life. So we just went into Soho rather than on one of the walks. He wanted me to help him drag these huge sacks of 1p and 2p coins, brown money as he calls it, to the bank to exchange for about £37.50. And it was like he was so pleased with that money. He's like, oh, this is great. I've got some cash. He really doesn't have any money.
Oh, bless him.
So there's all that. I think not being a star has allowed him to write these amazing songs which to this day are very underrated. I mean, okay, now people are discovering felt, which are kind of an easy sell because felt is beautiful and dreamlike and it's not really challenging. But by Mozart Estate, which is his current band, he's writing songs about, Poundland and homeless people sleeping in the doorway of heels, and the comparison of this beautiful, expensive bed and then just this thin sheet of glass. And certainly he hasn't got a social conscience as such. He's got social observation. And that allows him to write songs which are brilliant. And I can't think of anyone else who's doing it. And they're aligned to very kind of chirpy pop melodies, which makes it unusual. They're not dirgy or gothic or anything like that. They're very much pop, not like even punk or an angry. And so to do that is fascinating. And I really do think to this day, I mean, we play at Glastonbury, this guy is a legendary figure. He was playing in front of 30 people. Maybe things will begin changing, but he's 63 years old. He said he wants to be the first pensioner pop star. I mean, maybe it'll come true. I hope so.
I mean, I love Lawrence. I like Felt a lot, and I love Lawrence. And the show always loves your work, Will. Oh. So congratulations on Street Level Superstar, a year with Lawrence. And the author is Will Hodgkinson.
Thank you so much.
And that is all for this episode of Monocle on Culture. My great thanks to Will Hodgkinson, whose Street Level Superstar, A Year with Lawrence, is out now, published by 9/8 Books. And it really is a brilliant, brilliant book, and we heartily recommend it. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chungu, who also edits the show. We'll be back next week, but for the time being, from me, Robert Bounds, thank you for tuning in.